There is a version of the First World War that most people carry around without realizing it. It lives in the image of soldiers going over the top with bayonets fixed and flags raised, in the poetry of men who found beauty in sacrifice, in the bronze statues in town squares that show young men standing straight with their chins up and their eyes forward. It lives in the language of duty and honor that was printed in newspapers and read aloud in churches, in the sepia photographs of men in clean uniforms standing outside recruitment offices with wide smiles. That version is not false in every detail, but it is organized around an omission so vast that everything it shows becomes misleading. It leaves out what the war actually was to the people who lived inside it. Not the generals, not the politicians, the men in the ground. The First World War was not a story about courage overcoming fear. It was a story about what happens when an industrial civilization decides to solve a political problem using the same logic it applies to manufacturing. You calculate inputs, you calculate outputs, you measure efficiency, you adjust the variables. The variable that kept failing to behave predictably was the human being, and the system's response to that failure was not to reconsider the logic, it was to increase the inputs. By the time the war ended in November of 1918, somewhere between 17 and 20 million people were dead. The range of that estimate is itself a kind of statement. Nobody knows precisely how many people died, because the system that produced the deaths was not well designed for counting them all. Entire units were obliterated. Records were lost in the mud. Men disappeared so completely that their families received no notification, and no body, and no grave location. They simply stopped existing in any verifiable way. The bureaucracy would eventually send a form letter. The form letter used careful language. It did not say that the man had been reduced to fragments by artillery and scattered across several acres of Belgian farmland. It said he was missing. Missing was a category. Missing fit into filing systems. That is where the truth of this war actually lives. Not in the charge, not in the heroic last stand. It lives in the filing system. It lives in the gap between what was recorded and what happened. It lives in the letters that were never delivered, the reports that were suppressed, the medical observations that were classified, the photographs that were confiscated, the testimonies that were dismissed. The war produced an enormous quantity of paperwork precisely because paperwork gave the people managing the system a way to feel that the system was under control. The paperwork was the lie the system told itself. And the lie was necessary because the truth, if stated plainly in official documents, would have been this: we are feeding men into a machine that is not producing the results we were promised. We do not know how to stop, and we have decided to continue. To understand what that meant at the level of a single human life, you have to start before the trenches. You have to start in 1914 in the towns and villages of Britain and France and Germany and Austria and Belgium and dozens of other places where men lined up to enlist because they had been told that the war would be short, glorious, and morally necessary. The German soldier was told he was defending his civilization against encirclement by jealous enemies. The British soldier was told he was defending small nations against brutal aggression. The French soldier was told he was recovering what had been stolen from his country in 1871. Every nation gave its men a reason that was large enough to justify the discomfort of leaving home. Every nation made the same implicit promise: this will be over before winter. That promise was broken within months. The war that military planners had modeled on the quick, decisive campaigns of the previous century almost immediately became something that had no precedent in human experience. By the end of 1914, both sides had dug themselves into the ground along a line that stretched roughly 400 miles from the English Channel to the Swiss border. The trench system that resulted was not a temporary measure. It became a permanent geography. It became a world. And the men who entered that world discovered almost immediately that everything they had been told was either wrong or a deliberate misrepresentation. The conditions inside the trenches were an assault on every physical and psychological system a human body possesses. The ground itself was the first enemy. The Western Front ran through some of the most agriculturally productive land in Europe, which meant that the soil was deep and heavily worked and turned easily to mud. When the rains came, and in Flanders and Picardy, the rains came often and hard, the trenches flooded. The mud in some sectors was not simply wet earth. It was a semi-liquid mixture of soil and decomposing organic matter that could swallow a man to his waist. Men drowned in it. They drowned in mud in the middle of a battlefield without any enemy action involved. They stepped into a shell crater that had filled with water and mud, and they sank, and they could not be reached in time, and they died within yards of other men who could hear them calling out. That happened. It happened more than once. It happened enough that it was a known risk that was accounted for in the informal knowledge that experienced soldiers passed on to new arrivals. The smell was something that almost every survivor account mentions and almost no official document addresses. The frontline trenches smelled of decomposition, of human waste, of cordite, of unwashed bodies, of rotting wood, of the particular sweetish chemical smell of chlorine and mustard gas that lingered in low-lying areas long after an attack. The decomposition smell came primarily from the fact that the ground itself was full of bodies. Men who had died in earlier attacks lay in no man's land and could not be recovered. They lay in the mud between the lines, and they decomposed there. When new trenches were dug, the digging sometimes went through the remains of men from earlier in the war. This was not considered unusual enough to report. It was simply a feature of the environment. Rats were everywhere. The rats on the Western Front were not ordinary rats in the sense of being a minor nuisance. They were an infestation of significant scale, fed to considerable size by the food that was available to them. The men hated the rats, not only because of what they represented, but because of what they did. They ate the food supplies. They gnawed at equipment. They moved through the trenches at night in numbers large enough that men sleeping in their dugouts would wake up to find them crawling across their faces. The rats, unlike the men, were adapting successfully to the environment. They were thriving. The lice were constant. Every man in the trenches had them. They lived in the seams of clothing and they bit continuously, and the itching they produced was a low-grade chronic misery that had to be endured alongside everything else. Men would run lit candles along the seams of their shirts during rest periods, listening to the lice pop in the heat. It was called chatting, the process of delousing yourself. It was a social activity of a kind. Men sat together and picked lice off each other, and this was normal. This was how a significant portion of every rest period was spent. Trench foot was a medical condition that the military command did not initially understand, and did not initially want to understand, because understanding it properly would have required acknowledging that the conditions they were keeping men in were incompatible with basic physical health. Trench foot developed when feet were kept wet and cold for extended periods, which described the condition of virtually every man in the front-line trenches during the autumn and winter months. The feet swelled, the skin broke down, the tissue began to die. In advanced cases, gangrene set in and amputation was required. By the winter of 1914 to 1915, trench foot had disabled tens of thousands of men. The British Army's initial response was to issue orders requiring men to change their socks regularly and to rub whale oil on their feet. This response was organized around the belief that the problem was a failure of personal hygiene and self-maintenance, rather than a predictable physical consequence of the environment men were being kept in. The orders were issued. The orders were largely impossible to follow given the conditions. Men continued to develop trench foot. The condition continued to be treated in reports as a discipline problem for some time before medical reality forced a different assessment. Shell shock was a larger and more consequential problem, and it was handled by the military establishment with a combination of denial, misclassification, and deliberate cruelty that represents one of the more fully documented institutional failures of the entire war. The artillery bombardments that were the central feature of Western Front combat were not simply dangerous in the conventional sense of being likely to kill you. They were psychologically annihilating in a way that no previous form of warfare had produced at scale. A heavy bombardment of the kind that preceded major offensives could last for days. In some cases, it lasted for a week or more. During the preliminary bombardment before the Battle of the Somme in July of 1916, British artillery fired approximately 1.5 million shells over the course of 7 days. The men sheltering in the German trenches on the receiving end of that bombardment experienced something that had no precedent in human history. The noise alone was a physical phenomenon. The concussive force of shells detonating nearby could cause internal injuries without any fragment penetrating the body. Men were found dead without visible wounds. Something had simply been disrupted inside them at a level that left no mark on the surface. The men who survived prolonged bombardments were frequently changed by the experience in ways that did not immediately show up as physical injury. They trembled. They could not stop trembling even when they tried with every effort they possessed. They became mute. They wept without being able to stop or explain why. They lost the ability to walk or to see or to hear without any organic damage to their legs or eyes or ears. They screamed in their sleep. They became unable to tolerate the sound of a car backfiring or a door slamming without experiencing a physical response that looked from the outside like terror. They sat in dugouts and refused to move regardless of orders. These were the symptoms that came to be called shell shock, a name that reflected an early theory about the condition that was eventually shown to be incorrect, but that persisted in public usage because it was at least a name. The military establishment's response to shell shock was complicated by the fact that accepting it as a legitimate medical condition had operational consequences they were not willing to accept. If shell shock was real, if it was a genuine psychological wound produced by combat, then men suffering from it were not cowards or malingerers. They were casualties, and they had to be treated as casualties. That meant withdrawing them from the front. That meant losing fighting strength. That meant acknowledging that the conditions of industrial warfare were systematically destroying the mental function of the men subjected to them, which was an admission the system was not organized to make. The path of least resistance was to classify shell shock cases as disciplinary problems whenever possible, to accuse the men of cowardice or shirking, to send them back to the front, and when they broke down again or refused to go, to court-martial them. Between 1914 and 1918, the British Army executed 306 of its own soldiers after courts-martial. The majority of these men had been charged with desertion or cowardice in the face of the enemy. A significant proportion of them were almost certainly suffering from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder or acute combat-induced psychological breakdown. They were shot at dawn by firing squads composed of their fellow soldiers who were themselves under enormous psychological stress and who were ordered to carry out the executions as a matter of military discipline. The firing squads were given rum beforehand. The rum was an unofficial but widely practiced concession to the psychological difficulty of the task. The executions were recorded in military documents as having been carried out properly and in accordance with regulations. The men's families were typically informed that their relative had died in action. The circumstances were not described. The paperwork was arranged so that the stigma would remain manageable at the local level. The letters that soldiers sent home were censored. This is a fact that is widely known, but whose implications are not always fully appreciated. The censorship was not merely a matter of removing references to specific locations or unit movements that might be of use to the enemy. It extended to anything that might reduce civilian morale or complicate the official narrative of the war's purpose and progress. Letters describing the actual conditions in the trenches were routinely altered or confiscated. References to the scale of casualties were removed. Expressions of hopelessness or psychological breakdown were crossed out. Men learned over time what could and could not pass through the system, and they adjusted their letters accordingly. They wrote letters home that described a reality that was safer to describe. The letters that arrived in English and French and German homes were a curated version of the experience, shaped not only by what the soldiers chose to share, but by what the system permitted to be shared. The last letter. That phrase has a particular weight when you hold it against what is known about the censorship system. When a soldier was killed shortly after writing a letter, the letter might be in transit at the time of his death. It might be sitting in a censoring officer's file. It might have been flagged for content that seemed problematic. It might have been lost in the administrative chaos that attended the aftermath of a major engagement, when casualty processing became a massive logistical undertaking and individual documents moved through the system slowly or not at all. The last thing a man said to his family in writing might have been a letter that arrived after the notification of his death, or a letter that arrived weeks after the notification with its most honest passages removed, or a letter that never arrived at all, because the system that was supposed to deliver it had other priorities. There is a specific and well-documented category of correspondence that illustrates this most clearly: the letters and personal effects that were supposed to be returned to families after a soldier's death. The procedure was clear in regulation. A man's personal effects, including any correspondence in his possession, were to be collected, catalogued, and returned to his next of kin. The procedure was not well followed in practice. The chaos of the battlefield meant that personal effects were often lost, stolen, misplaced, or simply not collected because the priority in the immediate aftermath of a battle was moving the wounded and reorganizing the survivors, not retrieving the letters a dead man had in his pocket. The letters in those pockets contained things that the official correspondence did not. They contained the uncensored version. They contained what the man had meant to send, but had not yet had the chance to send, or had been carrying around and rereading because it was written by someone he missed, or had been holding back because he was not sure it would pass the censor. Those letters went into the ground or into the mud or into the fire of an artillery barrage, and they did not come back. The medical establishment was another system that processed the war through a framework of categories and procedures that were fundamentally inadequate to what they were being asked to address. The field hospital system was designed around the kinds of injuries that previous wars had produced at a scale and rate that was manageable. The industrialized artillery war of the Western Front produced injuries at a rate and of a type that overwhelmed every assumption the system was built on. The wounds from high-explosive shells were different from bullet wounds in ways that were medically significant and that surgeons had not previously encountered at this scale. The fragmentation patterns of shells produced multiple wounds simultaneously. They drove contaminated material, mud, cloth, bone fragments, into body cavities in ways that made infection extremely difficult to manage before the development of effective antiseptic treatment protocols. Tetanus and gas gangrene killed men who had survived the initial wounding. The gas gangrene in particular was a feature of the Western Front that reflected the specific bacteriological properties of the soil, which had been heavily farmed and was rich in the anaerobic bacteria that produced the condition. Men who were wounded in Flanders had a significantly higher risk of gas gangrene than men wounded in cleaner soil environments. The medical system noted this and adjusted treatment protocols over time. The adjustment took time that men died during. The casualty clearing stations and field hospitals behind the lines operated under conditions of chronic overload during major offensives. During the first day of the Battle of the Somme, on the 1st of July 1916, the British Army suffered approximately 57,000 casualties. The medical system had been planned around an optimistic projection of what the offensive would produce. The projection was wrong in a way that was catastrophic. Men lay on stretchers waiting for surgery for hours, sometimes for a day or more. Triage decisions had to be made that no medical professional should have to make under normal circumstances. Men who were assessed as unlikely to survive the operation were set aside and given what comfort was available and left to die, because the surgical capacity had to be concentrated on men who had a reasonable chance of survival. This was not a failure of the medical personnel. It was a logical response to a situation that the system had created. The system had created it by sending 57,000 men into a battle against positions that had not been neutralized by the week-long preliminary bombardment, because the shells that had been used in the bombardment were a significant proportion defective, had failed to detonate, had not cut the wire they were supposed to cut, had not destroyed the deep German dugouts they were supposed to destroy. The wire. This is a detail that appears in almost every account of the Somme, and that has been analyzed extensively in military history, but that bears emphasis in terms of what it meant at the level of the individual soldier. The tactical plan for the 1st of July depended on the artillery preparation having destroyed the German wire entanglements in front of their trenches. When the men went over the top at 7:30 in the morning, they discovered that the wire had not been cut. They had been told it would be cut. They had been told that the bombardment would make the advance relatively easy, that the German defenders would be destroyed or stunned, that they would be walking across ground that had been prepared for them. Instead, they found intact wire in front of German positions that were largely undamaged and fully manned by soldiers who had survived the bombardment in deep dugouts. The British soldiers who reached the wire and found it uncut had to search for gaps. While they were searching, the German machine gun crews came up from their dugouts and opened fire. The machine gun is the central weapon of the First World War in a way that is not always clearly stated. It was not new. The technology had existed since the 1880s and had been used in colonial conflicts to devastating effect. What was new was the application of the weapon in the context of industrial warfare between major powers that were both equipped with it and that both had the industrial capacity to manufacture ammunition at a scale that made sustained defensive fire essentially unlimited. A single machine gun crew could sustain a rate of fire of several hundred rounds per minute for as long as their ammunition supply lasted and as long as the barrel did not overheat, which could be managed with cooling systems. 2 or 3 machine gun positions, properly sited with overlapping fields of fire, could render a frontage of several hundred meters essentially impassable to infantry in the open. The defensive advantage that the machine gun provided to well-prepared positions was so overwhelming that it should have been obvious from the opening months of the war that the tactical doctrine of infantry assault against prepared defenses was not viable without either the destruction of the defensive positions beforehand or some other method of suppressing fire long enough for infantry to close the distance. This was not obvious to the command structures of the major powers, or rather, it was gradually understood, but the understanding did not translate quickly enough into a different strategy, and in the meantime the attacks continued. They continued because the alternative was to admit that the current strategy was failing, and admitting that required either accepting a negotiated outcome or finding a different way to fight, and both of those options had political and institutional costs that the command structures were not willing to pay. So the attacks continued. They were refined. The artillery preparations were extended. New methods were tried. Gas was introduced. Tanks were eventually introduced. The tactical lessons were learned, slowly, at enormous cost. But for most of the war, the fundamental equation remained the same. Infantry attacking across open ground against machine gun positions in prepared defenses would sustain casualties at a rate that was, by any measure other than the one the system was using, catastrophically high. The system was measuring success by different metrics. The primary metric was ground gained. Yards, hundreds of yards, sometimes miles, during the larger offensives. The cost in lives per yard gained was calculated and recorded and presented to command authorities and to political leadership. The presentation of this information was organized in ways that tended to minimize its disturbing implications. The casualty figures were real, but they were embedded in optimistic assessments of enemy losses, in claims about damage to German morale, in projections about what a continuation of the current strategy would eventually produce. The men writing these assessments were not simply lying. Some of them believed what they wrote. Some of them had constructed an intellectual framework around the strategy that genuinely led them to the conclusion that the attrition was working, that the enemy was closer to breaking than the evidence clearly showed, that the next offensive would be the one that broke through. The framework was self-reinforcing because the command structure rewarded the people who operated within it and marginalized the people who challenged it. Douglas Haig, who commanded British forces on the Western Front for most of the war, kept a diary. The diary is a remarkable document in many ways, but one of its most striking features is the consistency with which it frames events in terms that validate his own strategic assessments. After the first day of the Somme, the diary entry does not reflect the scale of what had happened. It reflects a man who had processed a catastrophic operational failure through a framework that converted it into something manageable. He noted that the attack had met with mixed results. He assessed that the enemy had been severely damaged. He expressed confidence in the strategic direction. The 57,000 casualties are present in the entry in the way that an unpleasant but ultimately manageable complication is present. The framework did not break. The framework processed the data and produced the same output it had been producing before. The attacks continued. The French army had its own version of this story, and it was in some ways even starker. The French military tradition that entered the war in 1914 was organized around a doctrine of offensive action that was almost metaphysical in its conviction that aggressive spirit and the will to attack could overcome material disadvantage. This doctrine, which was associated with military thinkers like Ferdinand Foch and was embedded in the operational planning of the French command, led to a series of offensives in the opening months of the war that produced casualties so severe that the numbers are difficult to process. In August of 1914 alone, the French army suffered approximately 300,000 casualties. In the first 5 months of the war, France lost more men killed in action than the entire American military lost in the entire Second World War. The doctrine survived. The attacks continued. By 1917, something in the French army reached a point of failure that even the system's capacity for managing information and suppressing dissent could not contain. Beginning in late April of 1917, following the disastrous failure of the Nivelle offensive, which had been sold to the troops with promises of a definitive breakthrough that did not materialize, units throughout the French army began to refuse orders. The mutiny, because that is what it was, extended eventually to involvement by soldiers in roughly half of the French infantry divisions on the Western Front. The men were not refusing to defend their positions. They were refusing to participate in further offensive attacks that they had concluded were pointless and were killing them in large numbers for no result. They were, in the most literal sense, declining to be used as ammunition. The French command's response to the mutiny was to suppress it as completely as possible and to manage the process of restoration through a combination of repression and concession. Pétain, who replaced Nivelle as commander, visited units, listened to the complaints about food and leave and conditions, and made credible commitments to improvements. He also presided over the courts-martial of several thousand men. Of those, approximately 500 were sentenced to death. Approximately 40 to 50 were actually executed. The precise number remains uncertain because the records were handled carefully and some documentation was not preserved. The mutiny was suppressed. The information was controlled. The war continued. The German command, which had intelligence indicating that something significant was happening in the French army, did not realize the full extent of it because the French managed the information well enough to prevent exploitation. The German army had its own accumulating costs. The German experience of the war was shaped by a strategic reality that was in some ways even more constraining than that faced by the British and French. Germany was fighting on 2 major fronts simultaneously, with significant resource limitations against opponents who collectively had access to greater industrial and manpower reserves. The German High Command understood from relatively early in the war that the strategic situation was unfavorable in the long run and that the war needed to be ended on terms that Germany could accept before the balance shifted too far. The strategy they chose in response to this assessment was to attempt to bleed the French army white at Verdun in 1916, to inflict casualties on such a scale that France's will to continue the war would break. Falkenhayn, the German chief of staff who designed the strategy, apparently believed that France's commitment to defending Verdun regardless of cost could be exploited to draw the French into a battle of attrition on terms favorable to Germany. What actually happened at Verdun was that the battle lasted 10 months, from February to December of 1916, and that both sides suffered approximately 300,000 dead and similar numbers of wounded. The French did not break. The Germans sustained losses that significantly degraded their operational capacity on the Western Front. The battle produced some of the most terrible conditions of the entire war, in a landscape that had already been fought over and that became, under the sustained artillery fire, a surface of craters and mud and unexploded ordnance and human remains. Men who fought at Verdun described an experience that went beyond anything in the vocabulary of normal human suffering. The terrain itself was not recognizable as anything that had once been used for human purposes. It was a geology of war. It was what the ground looks like after industrial civilization has turned its full productive capacity toward destruction for 10 months in a relatively small area. The medical and psychological consequences of Verdun were processed through the same systems that processed everything else. The men were treated or they were not treated. They were sent back to the front or they were not. They received their documentation or they did not. The letters went through the censor or they did not. The records were kept or they were not. The system continued to function. The gas attacks deserve specific attention because they represent a case where the official narrative and the actual medical reality diverged in particularly well-documented ways. Chlorine gas was first used in significant quantities by the Germans at Ypres in April of 1915. The initial response of the British command to the gas attack was complicated by the fact that recognizing it required acknowledging a new and deeply disturbing dimension of the war, and by the fact that the men who survived the initial attack were reporting an experience that seemed almost implausible to those who had not been there. Men described a yellow-green cloud rolling toward them, and then, when it reached them, an inability to breathe, a burning sensation in the lungs and eyes, and then a rapid collapse. The men who received low doses and survived were often left with permanently damaged lung tissue. The men who received higher doses died relatively quickly of what was in effect controlled chemical drowning as their lungs filled with fluid. The British military response was initially to issue orders reassuring men that the gas was not as dangerous as it appeared, and that the proper response was to stand firm and, if possible, urinate on a cloth and hold it over the face, since ammonia had some neutralizing effect on chlorine. This advice was issued. It was issued knowing that it was inadequate. The development of effective gas masks took time, and during that time men were dying from gas attacks in ways that were poorly captured in the official casualty reporting. Gas casualties were medically complex because the effects could be delayed. A man exposed to a relatively low concentration of a persistent agent like mustard gas might not show clear symptoms for 12 to 24 hours. During that period, he would continue to function and would not be counted as a casualty. When the symptoms appeared, the initial presentation might be confused with other conditions. The diagnosis was not always made correctly. The long-term effects of gas exposure on survivors, the chronic lung problems, the skin conditions, the eye damage, were not systematically tracked. Mustard gas, which was introduced by Germany in 1917, was particularly vicious in ways that went beyond the immediate physical effects. It was designed not primarily to kill, but to incapacitate. A man exposed to mustard gas would suffer severe blistering of any skin exposed to the agent and of the eyes and mucous membranes. The blistering of the eyes frequently produced temporary or permanent blindness. The blistering of the skin in the groin and armpits, where the agent concentrated in folds of clothing, was extraordinarily painful. The casualty would require intensive nursing care for weeks. The intent was to create a medical burden on the enemy's support system, to divert medical resources, to take men out of action in a way that was expensive in terms of care. It was a weapon designed around the economics of the casualty processing system. It was designed to impose cost on the system at a point where the system was already under pressure. The men who were gassed and who survived with significant lung damage or eye damage or skin damage entered a medical system that was, again, struggling with the volume of what it was being asked to process. They were treated as best they could be treated. They were sometimes discharged from military service. They were sometimes returned to their units after partial recovery. They lived with the long-term consequences of their exposure in ways that were not systematically followed up by any official body. The men who went blind from mustard gas received care during the acute phase. After that, the system's interest in them diminished significantly. They were processed. They were given their documentation. They became civilians again, living with the damage the war had done to their bodies in a society that had constructed a narrative around the war that had limited room for what they represented. The relationship between the men at the front and the civilians at home became, over the course of the war, a relationship between two populations that were in some fundamental sense no longer speaking the same language. The men at the front had experienced something that civilian language did not have the words for, and they knew it, and the knowledge shaped what they wrote and what they said when they came home on leave. The leave itself was a documented source of psychological difficulty. Men who came home from the front for a few days found themselves in environments that were continuous with the world they had left, but that felt profoundly disconnected from what they had been living. The food was different. The noise was different. The people were different in the sense that they were living in a world where death was not the constant ambient possibility it was at the front, and the men on leave often found themselves unable to bridge the gap. They would sit at tables with their families and not be able to say what they needed to say. They would listen to people talk about the war in terms drawn from newspaper coverage and not be able to explain the distance between that narrative and their experience. And then they would go back. Going back was the thing that the system required. The leave ended. The orders came. The men went back to the same trench or to a trench like it, and they continued to do what they had been doing. This was the essential mechanism. The system required men to continue functioning in conditions that were systematically damaging to their capacity to function, and it enforced continuation through a combination of military law, social pressure, and the specific psychology of the combat group. The combat group was the primary social reality for most soldiers. The men in your unit were the people who understood your experience because they shared it. The bond that developed in those conditions was extremely strong, and it was one of the main things that kept men going back. Not duty in the abstract, not nationalism in the abstract. The concrete, specific obligation to the men on your left and right. The obligation that was the most real thing in an environment where almost everything else had become unreal. The experience of the men who were taken prisoner also illustrates the workings of the system in ways that are often overlooked. Approximately 8 million soldiers were taken prisoner during the First World War across all belligerents. The treatment of prisoners varied enormously depending on which power held them, at what point in the war they were taken, and what resources were available. The legal framework of the 1907 Hague Conventions provided a baseline that was unevenly respected. German prisoners held by Britain and France generally had their basic needs met, though conditions in camps varied. Allied prisoners held by Germany were subject to a system that deteriorated as the German supply situation worsened, particularly in 1917 and 1918, when the British naval blockade was significantly affecting German food supplies. The men in German prisoner of war camps in the last year of the war were eating what the German civilian population was eating, which was increasingly inadequate. The men taken prisoner often entered a liminal state with respect to the administrative systems of their own militaries. They were no longer on the rolls in the same way. Information about them was handled through the International Red Cross, through prisoner of war lists, through a system that was slow and incomplete, and that produced significant anxiety for families who knew only that their man had been reported missing and could not determine whether he was alive, dead, or captured. The letters that prisoners sent home through the prisoner of war correspondence system were censored by both the German authorities and by the British authorities when they arrived, so that what a family received was a letter that had passed through 2 layers of institutional filtering before it reached them. The naval war, which is less discussed in most accounts of the Western Front, but which was integral to the war's overall dynamics, produced its own category of disappeared men. The sailors lost with ships that sank quickly had no graves and no recoverable remains. The families of men lost at Jutland, the largest naval battle of the war, fought in May of 1916, in many cases had only the notification that their man was missing. Ships that went down in deep water took their crews with them completely. The sea as a burial site is absolute in a way that the land is not, or rather, that the land was not during the First World War, when at least in theory, bodies could be identified and recorded. The men who went down with ships in the North Sea were simply gone. The question of burial and commemoration was itself a significant source of institutional management throughout the war. The initial British Army policy was to bury men where they fell and to mark the graves as carefully as possible, with the intention of providing families with information about where their relative was interred. This policy was reasonable and was followed in many individual cases. It was undermined by the realities of the battlefield in ways that were systematic rather than exceptional. Men killed in artillery bombardments were sometimes not recoverable as individuals. Men killed in specific local actions that were later overrun by the enemy and then recaptured might be buried and reburied in graves that lost their markers. Men who died in no man's land stayed where they fell. The work of the Graves Registration Commission, which was responsible for managing this problem, was both vast and fundamentally inadequate to its stated purpose. The Thiepval Memorial to the Missing of the Somme, which was constructed after the war, lists the names of 72,000 British and South African soldiers who were killed on the Somme and who have no known grave. 72,000. That number is a statement about the scale of the disintegration that the battlefield produced. It is a number that tells you something about what shells and mud and combat did to the bodies of men. The memorial is a beautiful architectural structure, and it performs a genuine and important function in marking the loss. But it also represents a management of the loss, a conversion of the unbearable into the commemorative, a process by which the 72,000 who cannot be found are given names on a wall and thereby given a form of resolution that the reality did not provide. The reality did not provide resolution. That is perhaps the single most important thing to understand about the First World War and about what it did to the societies that fought it. The war did not end in a way that felt like resolution to most of the people who had lived through it. It ended with the collapse of the German army in the field, the abdication of the Kaiser, and the armistice of November 11th, 1918. The armistice was signed at 11 in the morning. In the hours before the armistice took effect, soldiers on both sides continued to be killed. Commanders ordered attacks in the morning of November 11th, knowing that the armistice was coming at 11. And men died in those attacks. The last British soldier killed in the war died at 1 minute to 11, according to the records. His name was George Price. He was a Canadian. He was shot by a sniper. He was 25 years old. The war ended 60 seconds later. The men who came home from the war came home to a society that had, over 4 years, developed a set of narratives about the war that served various social and political purposes. The narrative of sacrifice was essential to justifying the losses. If the men had died for something, then the loss was bearable. If they had died for nothing, if the war had been, as some critics argued even before it ended, a catastrophic failure of civilization rather than its defense, then the loss was not only unbearable, but morally indefensible. The official narrative chose the first option. The men who died had died for their country, for freedom, for the next generation. They had not died because a bureaucratic and military system had processed them with the same logic it applied to manufacturing problems and had found them insufficient to the task it had assigned them. The men who came home and who could not speak about what they had experienced were in many cases not choosing silence out of shame or stoicism. They were silent in part because what they had experienced was not translatable into the terms the official narrative was using. To describe what the war had actually been, to describe the smell of the trenches, the sound of artillery for days without stopping, the specific quality of the fear that was not heroic fear but grinding chronic fear, the sight of men being reduced to constituent parts by explosives, the paperwork that arrived after someone in your unit was killed, the particular indifference of the system to any individual within it. was to say something that the official narrative could not absorb without collapsing. So the men were largely silent, and the official narrative continued. The poets are remembered because they said something. Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon and others wrote about the war in terms that departed from the official narrative with varying degrees of directness. Owen's poem about gas, which is taught in schools across the English-speaking world, is the most famous of these departures, and it has been read as an anti-war statement, as a humanist protest, as a literary masterpiece. All of those things may be true. What is perhaps less often noted is that Owen wrote it while recovering at Craiglockhart Hospital in Scotland, where he was being treated for shell shock, that he returned to the front after his treatment, and that he was killed in action on November 4th, 1918, 1 week before the armistice. The letter informing his family of his death arrived on November 11th, 1918, the day the armistice was signed, as the church bells in Shrewsbury were ringing to celebrate the end of the war. The post-war period did not bring the reckoning that the scale of the war might have seemed to demand. The Versailles peace settlement of 1919 was organized around the principles of the victorious powers and produced outcomes that left almost everyone with significant grievances. Germany accepted humiliating terms under protest with consequences that are well known. The newly created or reconstituted states of Central and Eastern Europe found themselves in borders that corresponded imperfectly to the ethnic and political realities of the region. The colonial subjects of Britain and France who had fought in the war, and who had been told their service would be rewarded with greater recognition of their rights, found that the peace settlement did not alter the fundamental structure of the imperial relationship. The war had been fought, in part, in the name of principles that the peace did not deliver. The veterans who had done the fighting received their discharge papers. They received, in many cases, small pensions that did not adequately compensate for the physical damage the war had inflicted on their bodies. They received the right to march in commemorative parades on Armistice Day. They received the gratitude of a society that preferred its gratitude to be expressed in ways that did not require any extended engagement with what they had actually experienced. The men with missing limbs and disfigured faces were largely kept out of public view because their presence was disturbing to the narrative of glorious sacrifice. Hospitals for the severely disfigured existed in relative obscurity. The men who could not work because of the long-term effects of gas exposure or psychological damage struggled with a pension system that was inadequate and that frequently required them to argue for recognition of conditions that the system was reluctant to formally acknowledge. The graves. The graves were everywhere. The Imperial War Graves Commission, which was established to care for the cemeteries, made decisions about commemoration that reflected the social values of the time. All graves were to be equal, regardless of rank. This was a democratic principle applied to the democratic project of mass death. Each grave received the same headstone. Names were carved in stone. The cemeteries were laid out with care and maintained to a standard that made them in some ways more orderly and tended than most things the soldiers had experienced during their actual service. The cemeteries were a way of saying that the dead mattered. They were also a way of managing the dead, of giving the loss a form that could be visited and mourned in a structured way. The cemeteries continue to be visited. They continue to be maintained by an organization that is now called the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. The maintenance has continued without interruption for over 100 years. The soldiers who had no grave, whose bodies were consumed by the battlefield, are represented by memorials rather than headstones. The Menin Gate at Ypres lists the names of 54,000 Commonwealth soldiers missing in the Ypres salient. The Menin Gate was completed in 1927, and a ceremony of commemoration has been held at the gate every evening since, with the brief interruption of German occupation during the Second World War, at which point the ceremony was held in Brookwood Cemetery in England and resumed at the Menin Gate the day the war ended. Every evening, a bugler plays the last post. The traffic stops. The people gathered at the gate stand in silence. This has happened every evening for almost 100 years. The gate is not large enough to hold all the names of the missing in the Ypres salient, so the overflow, The additional 34,000 who could not fit on the gate are listed at the Tyncott Memorial several miles away. The normalizing of mass death did not happen after the war. It happened during the war, and it was the essential mechanism that allowed the war to continue. The process by which death at industrial scale becomes routine, becomes expected, becomes something that the system can process with the same efficiency it applies to supply problems and logistical challenges, was not a failure of the system. It was a feature, a system that experienced the death of 57,000 men in a single day as an unacceptable breakdown in normal operations would have been unable to continue. The system experienced it as a data point. The data point was processed. The assessment was made. The planning for the next offensive began. The men who ran the system were not monsters in any simple sense. Many of them believed in what they were doing. Many of them had genuine commitment to the cause as they understood it. Some of them experienced genuine anguish at the losses. Haig wept at some point after the Somme, according to some accounts. Whether he did or not does not change what happened. The tears of a general, however genuine, are not a modification of the system. The system does not feel. The system records. The system assesses. The system sends the orders. The system processes the returns. The last letter from the Western Front that was never delivered is not one letter. It is a category. It is the aggregate of everything that was written and not received, everything that was confiscated and not returned, everything that was carried in a dead man's pocket and went into the ground with him, everything that was written in a dugout at 2 a.m. by a man who knew that what he was writing could not pass the censor, and who wrote it anyway, because the alternative was silence, and who then kept it or burned it or sent it hoping it would somehow make it through. The category contains more truth about the war than anything that was officially transmitted, because the official transmission was organized around a purpose other than truth. The official transmission was organized around the continuation of the war. The continuation of the war required a continuous supply of men who were willing or who could be compelled to participate. The supply was maintained. The participation was compelled when it was not volunteered. The volunteering was organized through social pressure and propaganda and genuine conviction and all the other mechanisms that a society at war deploys to convert civilian men into soldiers. The compulsion was organized through conscription laws and military discipline and the formal and informal social penalties for resistance. The supply did not fail. The war continued until the supply was sufficient no longer, until the German army's manpower and material base could not sustain the losses it was incurring, until the American entry into the war in 1917 added a fresh supply to the Allied side that the German side could not match, until the balance finally tipped in a way that made the continuation of the war strategically impossible for one side. And then it stopped. It stopped not because the system recognized what it had done. It stopped because one side ran out of the capacity to continue. The stopping was not accompanied by a moment of collective recognition of what had happened. It was accompanied by the administrative processing of the armistice terms, by the filing of the final casualty returns, by the beginning of the process of demobilization, which was itself an enormous logistical undertaking managed with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had been applied to all the other logistical challenges of the war. The men came home, the paperwork was processed, the graves were registered, the missing were listed on memorials, the official histories were written in the years that followed, assessed the campaigns, identified the lessons learned, provided the comprehensive accounting that the record required. The official histories were thorough and in many ways honest within their methodological limits. They were organized around military and operational questions. They were not organized around the question of what the war had done to the men who fought it, because that was not the kind of question that official military history was designed to answer. The men who could not re-enter civilian life, who sat in rooms and trembled, who could not hold jobs, who drank, who became violent, who could not sleep without reliving what they had seen, who walked into the sea or stepped in front of vehicles or quietly gave up on living in ways that were not recorded as war deaths because they happened years after the armistice. Those men were not in the official accounting. Their deaths were not added to the 17 to 20 million. Their suffering was not included in the calculations. The calculations had already been completed. The war was over. The system had processed everything it was going to process. The files were closed. The fields where the battles were fought were eventually reclaimed. The land in the areas of heaviest fighting was so contaminated with unexploded ordnance, with shells that had failed to detonate and that lay in the soil waiting, that significant areas could not be farmed and were designated as permanent military cemeteries or as areas too dangerous to inhabit. The Zone Rouge in France, the Red Zone, encompassed several hundred square kilometers of land that was considered permanently uninhabitable due to contamination. The contamination is still there. Farmers in the Somme and Flanders regions still unearth shells when they plow. They call the annual harvest of shells and human remains the iron harvest. It is a named, recognized, regular phenomenon. Every year the ground gives up what was put into it. Every year the bomb disposal teams are called out. Every year remains are found that are sometimes identifiable and sometimes not. The war did not end in 1918. The war is still being processed. The ground is still returning what the system deposited into it 110 years ago, and the system continues to handle those returns with appropriate procedures, catalogues what can be catalogued, disposes of what cannot, and closes the files in the manner that files are closed.